Verse 17, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. Verse 18, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. And so Paul here is saying, you know what? You're not a slave of sin. Why would you go back to sin and live in sin when you've become a slave of righteousness? He says, I thank God, before you used to be a slave of sin. In your old life in Adam, you used to be a slave of sin, but now you've been born again in Christ and you've actually become a slave of righteousness. You've come into the position of righteousness. And I love that phrase, a slave of righteousness. And that actually speaks about our position in righteousness. Before, we were in sin, in the position of sin, and we were a slave to sin. But we were set free in Christ when we believed the gospel and we came into Christ and we came into a new position. And that position is we are slaves to righteousness. That is the position of righteousness. And so when we were slaves to sin, it didn't matter how much righteousness we tried to do. Nothing could take us out of the slavery of sin. It was only having faith in Christ that could take us out of it and bring us into righteousness. And so once we are now in righteousness, we are slaves to righteousness. And even if we were to do some bad things, some sins, that doesn't cause us to lose our position in righteousness. No, we are slaves. There was nothing you could do when you were a slave to sin to get away from that position of sin. And when you are a slave to righteousness, there is nothing you can do to get away from the position of righteousness. You are in righteousness. You are the righteousness of God. You will always be the righteousness of God because now you are a slave to righteousness. And no matter what you do, you can never not be a slave to righteousness. Now, I know that this is very hard for many people to accept because immediately they will ask the silly question, well, does that mean it's okay just to sin? No, that's not what I'm saying. And that's not what Paul's saying. And that's not what the gospel is saying. But the truth is, once you come into Christ, you are set free from the position of the slavery of sin and you come into the position of the slavery of righteousness, and nothing can take you out of that. Because why? You're a slave to it. And I'll go even a little bit further to say that even if you decide you want to come out of it and you want to reject Christ and denounce Christ and denounce your faith, and say, well, no, I don't want to be a slave to righteousness anymore. I'm leaving. I'm going somewhere else. Even if you want to do that, you can't, because you are a slave to righteousness. There is nowhere else you can go. You've died to everything else, and you are alive with Christ. And Christ can never die, and you can never die. And in order to go somewhere else, you would have to die, spiritually die. But you can't. And so there's nowhere else you can go. You're a slave. You're a slave to Christ. You're a slave to righteousness. And I love it. It's glorious. That's the kind of slave that I want to be. And that fills me with peace. That fills me with relief. Wow. Even if I mess up and do stupid stuff, God forbid. By no means, no way. But even if I did for some stupid reason, I cannot lose my position in Christ. I am held secure there. I am a slave to righteousness. Now, while I am a slave to righteousness, I could give in to sin and become a slave to sin. And that doesn't mean I'm no longer a slave to righteousness. It just means even though I'm born again in Christ, I'm allowing myself to become a slave of sin. And that sin wants to hurt me and destroy my life and distract me from Christ and bring destruction and bring death into my life. And so the reality is, when we're in Christ, we'd be crazy to just go and give in to sin. And it doesn't actually make sense. Now that we're slaves to righteousness and slaves to God, why would we go and give in to sin? Sin just wants to hurt us and destroy us. And so why would we do that? Also, sin has no power over us. It has no dominion. So why would we submit ourselves again to it? It doesn't make sense. And that's what Paul is saying. He's saying, since you are in Christ and a slave to righteousness, now live in that. Live from your position of righteousness and let that righteousness manifest through your mortal body so that it leads you in doing righteous things with your body. And that is simply the fruit of being in the position of righteousness manifesting through our lives.